Julie Pacey was born Julie Elizabeth Wilkinson on the 28th of November 1955 at Grantham Hospital to her parents, Keith and Joy. She grew up in Grantham and remained there throughout her life. She later married Andrew Pacey, her childhood sweetheart, and together they had 2 children. By 1994, Julie was 38 years old and working part-time at a nursery in Grantham, a role that fitted around family life and meant she was usually home during the afternoon, before her children returned from school. The Pacey family lived in a residential area of Grantham. Their home was described as tidy and well-kept, in a neighborhood not associated with serious crime. Nothing in Julie's background suggested she lived a high-risk lifestyle. There were no known disputes, no reported threats, and no public indication that she was expecting danger on the day she was killed. On the afternoon of her murder, in September 1994, Julie returned home after work as part of her normal routine. At approximately 4:15 p.m., her daughter arrived home from school and found Julie in the bathroom. Emergency services were called, but Julie was already dead. Julie had been sexually assaulted and killed by strangulation. There were no signs of a prolonged or violent struggle. Her fingernails were intact, and there were no defensive injuries. Her upper clothing was undisturbed, while her tights and underwear had been lowered. The house was not ransacked, and there was no indication of a burglary in progress. Police found no evidence of forced entry. Doors and windows were intact, with no damage consistent with a break-in. Investigators concluded that the offender either gained access because the house was unsecured or because Julie herself allowed the person inside. This point has remained central to the case. Witnesses reported seeing a metallic blue BMW in the vicinity of the Pacey home around the time Julie returned that afternoon. One sighting was particularly significant. The vehicle was seen turning onto Julie's driveway, where her Audi was already parked, by an acquaintance of Julie's. Andrew Pacey and other members of the family later confirmed that Julie did not have access to such a vehicle, and that no BMW was associated with the household. Despite this, no public explanation for the BMW's presence was ever established, and it was never conclusively linked to any individual. Around the same period, several witnesses described seeing a man wearing blue overalls in the area. He was described as stocky, with a ruddy complexion and work boots. An e-fit was produced and circulated. The man was not conclusively identified, and no one was charged in connection with these sightings. A watch belonging to Julie was later reported missing from the house. Aside from this item, there was no evidence of theft. The investigation was extensive, involving house-to-house inquiries, national media appeals, and later forensic review. In 2015, police announced that a near-complete DNA profile believed to belong to the offender had been obtained, but it did not match anyone on the national database. The case remains unsolved. These are the facts that have been publicly available for 3 decades. At this point, the story stops. Not because there are no facts left, but because the facts no longer explain themselves. What remains is a sequence of events that ends in a death, surrounded by unanswered questions. Now we begin again. This time, the case is stripped of names, relationships, and assumptions. The focus shifts away from who might be responsible and towards how the crime actually worked. Entry, control, time, space, exit. These elements matter because they do not change with memory, opinion, or narrative. Mechanics persist even when explanations fail. Julie Pacey was killed inside her own home in the middle of the afternoon. There was no forced entry. Mechanically, this immediately constrains the offender's options. Either the house was unsecured, or the offender was allowed inside. Whatever followed began with access that did not require violence. Once inside, the offender was able to establish control. Julie was sexually assaulted and killed by strangulation. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle, and no evidence of restraint or binding. Control was achieved quickly and effectively. In mechanical terms, this is compliance-led control rather than force-led control. The bathroom becomes critical. It has been reported that Julie's daughter had to force the bathroom door open because it was obstructed by Julie's body. If this account is accurate, it carries unavoidable mechanical consequences. A body positioned against the inward swing of a door creates a physical barrier. If Julie had already been lying in that position when the offender needed to leave the bathroom, the offender would have faced the same obstruction. He would not have been able to exit cleanly without moving her body, repositioning it, or forcing the door against resistance. There is no public indication of disturbance consistent with that kind of hurried manipulation. Mechanically, this creates a contradiction. If the offender exited the bathroom without difficulty, and the door was later obstructed by Julie's body, then the obstruction must have occurred after the offender had already left the room. One plausible explanation is that Julie was still alive, or at least capable of movement, when the offender exited, and that she collapsed or repositioned herself afterwards, unintentionally blocking the door. What mechanics does not support is a clean exit from a bathroom where a lifeless body was already wedged behind the door in a way that later required force to overcome. The offender did leave the house. There was no indication of panic, no obvious trail, and no forced escape. The exit appears to have been as controlled as the entry. This is where the BMW returns to the analysis. Not as a clue, but as a mechanical facilitator. Its presence is not hypothetical. It was seen turning onto the driveway by someone who knew Julie well enough to recognize that it did not belong there. Mechanically, a vehicle positioned close to the scene provides clear advantages. It allows an offender to arrive and leave quickly, to place distance between the crime and the exit point, and to reduce reliance on local familiarity. It lowers the risk of interception on foot and limits exposure time in the immediate area. Once that function is understood, further questions arise, not as accusations, but as practical possibilities. If the vehicle did not belong to Julie, how might it legitimately have been there without immediately raising suspicion? One possibility is that it was borrowed. Another is that it was a test-driven vehicle. It may also have been connected to an independent trader or small dealership, where vehicles move informally, and record-keeping is limited. Even the possibility that it was being viewed or driven in connection with a gift, such as a birthday or anniversary present, cannot be ruled out on mechanics alone. The distinction between a large dealership and a small independent operation matters. Large franchise dealerships operate with layers of traceability. Vehicles are logged in and out. Test drives are recorded. Staff roles are separated. If a BMW from such a dealership had been present at Julie's home, it is far more likely that someone would later have been able to say, "Yes, that was one of ours." The absence of such confirmation becomes informative. Small independent dealerships and sole traders operate differently. The same individual may buy, repair, prepare, and sell vehicles. Test drives can be informal. Cars can change hands quickly. In that context, a vehicle can appear briefly at a residential address without leaving a clear paper trail or institutional memory. The sightings of a man wearing blue overalls align with this same mechanical framework. Overalls are not a disguise. They are a role. In a small dealership or sole trader environment, it is entirely plausible that the person driving the vehicle is also the person repairing or preparing it. Overalls signal work, legitimacy, and purpose. A person dressed that way can stand on a driveway, knock on a door, or move through a residential neighborhood in daylight without attracting suspicion. Mechanically, the BMW and the overalls are not separate curiosities. Together, they describe a functional access model, legitimate appearance, low-risk approach, controlled interaction, and rapid departure. This does not identify an offender. It does not assert ownership of the vehicle. It does not accuse. It simply explains how certain practical barriers, access, presence, and exit can be overcome without force. When these mechanics are laid out plainly, daytime access without force, compliance-led control, sexual assault, strangulation, and a controlled exit, they are no longer unique. When the same framework is applied to other unsolved cases, structural similarities begin to emerge. Jacqueline Palmer Radford was 40 years old and lived in Eversley, Hampshire. She was last known to be alive after a telephone call to her mother. Later that day, she was found dead in her home by one of her children. There was no evidence of forced entry. She was sexually assaulted and killed by strangulation. There were no signs of restraint, no ransacking, and no indication of a prolonged struggle. The offender was able to operate during the day and leave without drawing attention. The case remains unsolved. Lynn Wheaton was found murdered inside her own home. As with the other cases, there was no evidence of forced entry. She was sexually assaulted and killed by strangulation. There were no signs of binding or gagging and no indication of a chaotic struggle. The scene showed control rather than panic, and the offender was able to leave without urgency. The case remains unsolved. Viewed together, these cases share a common mechanical structure. Entry is achieved without force. Control is established quickly and without restraint. Sexual assault is followed by strangulation. The scene shows minimal disturbance and a clean exit. Each offense takes place in a domestic setting during daylight or early evening hours, and each remains unsolved. These similarities do not identify an offender and do not prove a single series. What they demonstrate is that the same practical problems were solved in the same way. The purpose here is not to accuse, but to define what is mechanically possible. This research analysis does not end with a name. It does not end with an arrest, a theory, or a neat explanation. It ends where the evidence ends. What has been presented here is not a solution, but a structure. A way of examining crimes that removes personality, motive, and speculation, and focuses instead on how these acts were carried out, how access was gained, how control was maintained, how violence was applied, and how the offender was able to leave without being caught. Julie Pacey's murder remains unsolved. So did the deaths of Jacqueline Palmer Radford and Lynn Wheaton. Nothing in this analysis claims otherwise. What it does show is that these crimes did not occur in isolation, and that their similarities are not matters of storytelling, but of mechanics. Patterns do not accuse. They do not replace investigations. They do not name the guilty, but they do narrow the space in which answers can exist. If these crimes share the same structure, then that structure matters. And if it matters, it deserves to be examined, carefully, lawfully, and without assumption. Because truth does not need to make sense, but understanding how it works is where answers begin.